we're going to be talking, I'm going to try to focus on key principles of nonprofit law today. I'm going to really try to start from kind of the ground up, the things you sign up for by being a nonprofit, and the things that if I'm the only lawyer you hear from this year, I would want you to hear if I can squeeze it into a 2-hour talk. Like Carmen said, we'll be taking a break in the middle. We'll have breaks for questions. Please feel free to drop questions into the chat. I may stop and sort of, when we're switching between topics, break to pick a couple up, and then there'll be a couple breaks where we'll kind of run through questions together. As we put this together, I tried to break it into short-term and long-term, right? Like the things I want you to think about right now or the short term. What are there are certain things you need to have in order to be properly formed. Make sure you have them, know where they are, and we'll talk about what those are. Compliance requirements, what are the agencies you have to deal with? We'll talk about what those are and what it takes. I want to send a few words on fiscal sponsorship. And just because, whether you're doing fiscal sponsorship or you are a fiscally sponsored project, or you're thinking about one, there's just some concepts I want to make sure I get out there, because fiscal sponsorship can be a great thing when it's done well, and a messy thing when it's done poorly. In the long, and I want to pivot to sort of long term. I want to just sort of talk about generally, what does it mean to be a 501c3 public charity? How is it regulated on the federal level, and what are some of the key issues? I want to talk about a little bit about endowments, a little about different kinds of ways of generating revenue. And then I'm going to do something a little brave and try to pretend to be an employment lawyer for a couple of minutes and talk to you about handbooks and procedures and employees, contractors, volunteers. You'll probably hear me give this disclaimer a couple of times. I'm a tax and corporate lawyer. I'm outside general counsel of nonprofits. I talk about these issues a lot, but hardly my area of expertise. But there's a few key concepts that I know, and I would like nonprofits to know if they have employees. So with that, let's get started. Like I said, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll be talking to each other for a little bit. So short-term tasks. Here's what should have already happened. And like I will say, in general, this talk is going to apply to all 501c3 nonprofits. Although we typically focus on public charities. We are focused a bit on faith-based organizations. Unless I tell you otherwise, this applies generally, but you'll see that there's a couple slides where we get into some nuances for being a faith-based organization or a church. First thing I would expect you to have is articles of incorporation. Those get filed with the Secretary of the State. They're the thing that puts you into existence. They are not very interesting. All that they should say are the name of the corporation, your initial address, your agent for service, some magic language that 501c3 requires in order for you to qualify as being exempt. But you need to have them, and they need to be filed with the Secretary of State. All the other documents on this page don't really get filed anywhere. This is the document that gets filed and is on record. And if you change it, you need to file it with the Secretary of State again. The first question I would ask you, if I were looking at your articles and you were here in California, assuming you incorporate in California, some nonprofits incorporate in other states, like Delaware is a pretty common one. But most California nonprofits incorporate here. Did you form as a public benefit corp or religious corp? California's got a few different kinds of nonprofits. The two that can be charities are public benefit corps and religious corps. It's probably self-explanatory, but religious corps are the ones that are organized primarily for religious purposes, and public benefit is every other kind of charity. Which one you are can make a big difference, because it can determine what kind of rules apply to you. You'll see as we go on, there are certain kinds of registrations that religious corps don't need to do that public benefits do. A religious corp is more than just a church. There's lots of kinds of religious corps. It could be a church. It could also just be sort of any other faith-based organization that decided, yeah, we're doing charitable things, but it's our work primarily driven by religious purposes. Religion and charity are intertwined for us. So it might be one or the other, and important for you to understand which. The next thing I look at when somebody sends me their articles is what their purposes say. So we'll probably get into this a couple different times, but there's a core concept as a nonprofit, which is the charitable trust doctrine. When people give you money, there's a couple different ways you can have purpose restrictions impressed on it. In other words, I give you $100, but if I give you $100 to, for an animal shelter, you can't go use it for a hospital, a human hospital. there's a couple ways that research aid could be created. It could be created just the way I described it, as your donor imposing it. It could also be created in your articles of incorporation. So what I generally want is for articles of incorporation to let an organization do everything that 501c3 allows. That way, if people change their mind, they don't get an unpleasant surprise that they can't do the new program they want to do. But you'll check all the time and you'll go and find the articles of incorporation that have purposes of we are only going to do A, B, and C thing, and we're only going to do it on Tuesday from 9 to 12. And those sort of purpose restrictions can be very limiting and can catch people by surprise. So if you haven't looked at your articles lately, make sure you go and take a look. The next thing we're going to talk about, I tend to look at our bylaws. These are usually a bit more detailed, 10, 15 pages. Bylaws cover a lot of the sort of one function they provide is they kind of recite a lot of the nonprofit rules and law that apply to you as a California nonprofit corporation. But you also have some choices to make. How do you want your directors to be elected? Are your directors elected by just one person? That's an option in California, that one person can appoint the whole board. Or are you like most nonprofits where your board elects your board? Every year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever the terms are up, people get together and vote on who the next directors are going to be. Those are two very different organizations, types of structures, and they mean something very different for control. I mean, a lot of nonprofits where, the founder who created it created what, pulled forms offline, created a self-electing board where the whole board elects the directors. They appointed their, 4 friends to be the directors with them. And all of a sudden they're not that friendly. And then the 4 friends decide they want to do something different with a nonprofit. Well, if you had created a designator structure where the person could appoint the whole board and take people away, that person would still have control. But because they didn't do that, they wouldn't. So this stuff's really important. And when things get ugly, going to your bylaws can be really important. So, make sure if you haven't read them lately, give a read, see what kind of officer positions you have. I'm going to say you're probably going to have a president, secretary, treasurer. You might also have a chair or vice president. Are you filling these positions? When's the last time you elected them? Because your bylaws probably say that you're electing them annually. So if you haven't done that lately, you're going to go in and check. Your bylaws will also talk about when you should have meetings, how you can call them. If you have members is a whole fun topic we could get into, and I'll come back to in a second. How are documents signed, who signs checks, who signs contracts, all that fun stuff. Boring lawyer stuff, but still important that you know as an organization that you're following your bylaws. If there's ever an issue that comes up in the future, if the Attorney General audits, if the IRS audits, it's really good to be able to show that we are following our bylaws. If the bylaws are something nobody's looked at in 20 years, you all know that sometimes that's true. That can be a pretty bad fact. On the concept of members, the concept of members refers to the nonprofit equivalent of a shareholder. So in the for-profit world, you have shareholders. I own this company, and I both have voting rights. I get to decide who's on the board and how decisions are made. And I also have economic rights. I get profits at the end of the day, right? Those are the kind of nice things about being a shareholder. In the nonprofit world, we know that there's no profits right there in the name. But we do know, but sometimes we want to give certain people the voting rights of shareholders. An example might be like the Sierra Club. Everyone who's a member of the Sierra Club gets to vote on the board. There are other organizations where sort of democracy is so fundamental to what they're doing that they want to empower their members to vote on the board. This is an option. It's always an option I tell people to approach cautiously. Some of the messiest nonprofit corporate matters I run into are with people decided they wanted to have members instead of just letting people have a voice in other ways. My last point on it is just sort of membership can be great. It's sort of the good thing about membership. It's creating a little miniature constitutional democracy unto yourself and your network and your stakeholders and your constituents, all the people you're serving. The downside is, as you may have noticed from time to time, constitutional democracy is kind of a mess. It takes a lot of work. People get pretty upset. There's a lot of rules to follow. It's hard to follow those rules, and it can really drive up a lot of complexity. So this is a long way of saying, when you go to your bylaws, do you have members or not? It's an important question to answer. If you don't, then you're probably in for an easier ride in terms of corporate governance. If you do, you might want to start thinking about, are you doing all the things your bylaw says you need to do for your members? The next thing I'd want you to have when if you're already in existence, is your initial corporate actions. Typically There's going to be an action of sole incorporator, where whoever signed the article says, okay, here are the 5 directors. So these 3 people are the officers. I'm adopting the bylaws. You should have that. If you don't know where that is, try to track it down. It might also be sort of first meeting minutes, where your initial board gets together and kind of makes a bunch of the key decisions. Okay, here's where our address is. Yes, we're going to apply for taxes on status. We're going to hire this executive director. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. I'd like to see an initial document like that, and so hopefully you have that. Appointing directors and officers will typically happen in the corporate action, and of course it'll happen every year, every 2 years, whatever the term lengths are. I at least want those initial corporate actions, and of course we kind of want them on an ongoing basis. The last thing, the last thing I know I always want to see here is a conflict of interest policy. A couple of reasons people have a conflict of interest policy. The bad reason to have a conflict of interest policy is, well, when you apply to the IRS, they say you need to have one, so we have one, but we don't look at it otherwise. The good reason to have a conflict of interest policy is, as we're going to talk about, directors have fiduciary duties. One of those fiduciary duties is the duty of loyalty. And in order to satisfy the duty of loyalty, you need to do things like, when a conflict comes up, if I have both a personal interest and it conflicts with the interests of my nonprofit, I need to resolve that appropriately. I need to disclose my conflict. I need to recuse myself. I need the other directors to make the call. And you might say, oh, I don't have that. We don't, we're just a regular old nonprofit. We don't have conflicts of interest. We're boring. And I would say, okay, but do you pay anybody? Do you pay yourself? Is there a CEO who's paying? That decision, if that person is on the board, is a conflict of interest, right? When you're going to vote on how much they're going to be paid, whether they're going to be paid, that is a conflict of interest. And when you're going to approve that, you should go look at your conflict of interest policy. There's also other rules that may hopefully be baked in your conflict of interest policy about certain findings the board should make when they're approving executive comp in California. So yeah, hopefully those things are there. If you don't have them, good to talk to somebody about maybe where they might be, or if you need to fill in some gaps, how you can fill in those gaps. The other thing I want to talk sort of short term is operating an organization. Keeping up with the law and best practices. So a few things going on here. Let's start with fiduciary duties. Fiduciary duties is a word that lawyers like me use to scare people into taking their job seriously. And I say that, kind of jokingly, but actually kind of seriously. The nonprofit sector is an interesting place, right? What people often don't realize is that the board of directors is the body that has ultimate control over an organization. But we don't always think about board roles that way, right? Sometimes there are a lot of people who approach board as, well, I gave some money to this nonprofit, so they asked me to serve on the board, or I can serve on the board if I can find enough friends to give money to it, or I just kind of want, I have a lot of prestige in this sector, so they asked me to be on the board to kind of signal my support. All that stuff is well and good, but what people don't always appreciate is that by signing up on the board, you sign up for fiduciary duties, which are a high form of duty that says you have a duty of care and a duty of loyalty. And if you don't fulfill those duties, you could be held personally liable by the Attorney General for harm caused to the organization for breaching those duties. So it's really important to do them. And so often when you hear lawyers cite fiduciary duties, if they're talking to your organization, they're saying, you guys need to think about your fiduciary duties. What they're really saying is, hey, board, you're not taking this seriously enough. You need to make sure this organization is being run properly, that the money is being stewarded carefully, and that people aren't dealing in their own interest. So just to kind of tease it out a bit, the duty of care refers to the duty of every director to use their best business judgment in a manner that an ordinarily prudent person does. There's more legalese to that, but that's the gist of it. Just be prudent. You don't have to be perfect, but you do need to be prudent. And one way to satisfy your duty of care is to show that you're relying on experts. So to be on the board, yes, you have ultimate control, but that doesn't mean it's not a day-to-day job. You don't have to understand every topic, but you can rely on your CEO. And that's typically what the board does. Is the board's primary job is to review the CEO's work. But you got to pay attention. You got to ask questions. And if the CEO seems like they're not giving you good information, you may need to dig deeper. You can rely on outside experts like me. When I give people advice and the board relies on it, that's a way of showing they've satisfied their fiduciary duties. But you have to rely on experts, on the right thing. So if you ask me a question about nonprofit law, I would say, that's great. You're relying on me. If you If I don't know, the nonprofit has a car and you're asking me to fix it, well, that's not a good exercise of fiduciary duties because I can't even fix a bike. So I wouldn't, it's about reasonable reliance. Reliance is important. It's the way that the board typically satisfies their duties, but it needs to be reasonable. So just always think about, if I'm on a board, who am I listening to do my job? And am I really listening? And am I asking questions? And when I ask those questions, do I get answers that make me feel like they know what they're talking about? The next topic is board meetings. It's related to the fiduciary duties, and board meetings are one way to think about it is how you prove to the regulators and other people and donors that you're actually fulfilling your fiduciary duties. Board meetings are where the board acts. When you're a director on a board, you don't have day-to-day authority. If you're an officer, you might, and we'll talk about officers, but as a director, you don't have day-to-day authority. Your job is to show up in meetings and vote and make decisions as a whole group. And in terms of frequency, I mean, the bare minimum is once a year. If you're an organization with enough going on, quarterly might be, more reasonable. Twice a year, maybe twice a year with some committee meetings in between, your investment committee or your audit committee, if you're big enough, or your grants committee or development committee, real estate committee. It depends on what kind that you're doing, but committees are a good way to sort of break up the work, give the board spread expertise where people want to do it. But you need to have meetings, and there's I don't want to say there's no point in having a meeting if you don't document it, but that's how the AG tends to look at it, because maybe you and the board, your board just make such great decisions and they're just nailing it every time, and in spite of that, something goes wrong 5 years later. Well, the fact that the board is trying to do their best is good enough, but it's not good enough if you can't prove they did it. And if the AG comes in and says, well, you haven't met for 10 years because I don't see any minutes, that's a bad position to be in. And every time I say the AG, I mean the Attorney General, which regulates charities. We'll get to them soon. Subject matter, when I'm talking to boards, one of the things I'm talking about the most is that finding that balance between, being sufficiently present and not being micromanaging. The role of the board isn't to make day-to-day decisions. It's not to go, your board shouldn't be going in and talking to individual employees and doing those sort of things, but they also need to sort of not be asleep at the wheel. So that's an important role for the board. And so when you think about the subject matter of the board, are we sufficiently high level? Are we not getting lost in the details? And every organization is different, but these are the goals I encourage people to strive for. Corporate records. Do you have your corporate records all together? Not just all the documents I listed, those are important, but your determination letter. I assume you have a determination letter from the IRS that says you're a 501c3. Do you have a copy of that? Do you have a copy of all your filings, your Form 990s, if you file Form 990s with the IRS? Contracts, government correspondence, all that stuff should be in a minute book somewhere, electronic, paper, don't care. I just know that when someone comes and asks for it, I want you to be able to find it quickly. So that's what we need in terms of corporate records. Financial statements and controls. Every organization's a bit different here, but I think just the bottom line would be, remember that this isn't your money. It's not even your business's money. It is the public's money, for lack of a better word, and is a separate organization. You might, if you have an LLC, you might feel like that's taking money out of your left pocket and putting it in your right pocket. If you move money, and to some degree that can be true. If it's a single member LLC, it's still not great, but the consequences of messing up with your personal business may be a little reduced. When you're talking about a nonprofit, you're talking about really truly, if you're mismanaging the money, you're commingling funds, or accidentally making a payment for a vacation on the nonprofit's card, you're taking money from the public, you're taking money from a highly regulated organization and putting it in your pocket. And I'll just tell you, that's pretty bad. So very important. Having financial controls to avoid those situations is really important. Another good principle is multiple people looking at everything. Don't be the only person that looks at your records, looks at your books. Make sure there's always sort of two sets of eyes on things. Embezzlement is pretty widespread in the nonprofit sector, and I could do a whole talk about how it happens and why it happens and how and all that stuff. But just in short, if you ever hear yourself saying, "Oh, that would never happen at an organization like ours," that is truly what they all say. The last point I'll make is on director and officer insurance. There's a few ways you can protect yourself as an organization. That's, the first way to protect yourself is do things right. Don't follow the things I've talked about. But no one's perfect, and sometimes people make mistakes, and harm happens to the organization. And like I said, if that harm comes from a breach of duty, you have a potential personal exposure. You could have other directors suing you. You could have the AG enforcing an action. You could have third parties suing the organization and saying this happened because you breached your duty of care, or you were self-dealing in your own interest. This is why you want directors and officers insurance. Is the first line of protection is to do things as prudently, correctly, document it, but to back that up, you want to have directors and officers of insurance. There's nonprofits, there's NIAC, there's Cal Nonprofits Insurance. There's lots of nonprofits out there that make sure that other nonprofits have insurance and hopefully subsidize it to some degree so that you can get it. So even if you're a relatively small organization, I encourage you to get directors and officers insurance, because what happens is someone sues and maybe they're 100% wrong, but this is America, and anyone can sue anyone for anything. And it's when people get sued, they're really happy to have directors and officers insurance pay the legal bills to talk to someone to cover that. So it's something I really encourage, if you don't have it already, to talk about. So just pausing there for a second, we've kind of run through some of the short-term things. These are the things that if you're an existing organization, I would love to know that you already kind of have. And if you find that you go through your records and we don't have this, we don't have that, go back and look and talk as a board and see what we can do to start filling in those gaps going forward. And I'm going to pivot now to switching a little bit from talking. And if anyone had any questions on that, we could. I'll take that question right now because it's a really good one. Director and officer insurance is different from general liability insurance. Short answer is yes. Medium answer is what I would do is talk to a nonprofit insurance broker. I talk about what kinds of insurance do we need. I'll tell you what general liability insurance covers you is sort of insurance in the course of operations. So, slip and fall, someone, that kind of thing. Things happening in the course of you doing your activities. Director and officer insurance is about protecting against if someone claims that you breached your fiduciary duties as a director or an officer. So it's something that I recommend nonprofits buy, and for sophisticated organizations or sophisticated directors, those directors will say, look, I'm not going on this board unless you have some insurance, because I heard what Karl said a few minutes ago, where by being on a board, I have fiduciary duties, and I heard that fiduciary duties mean potential liability if I do something wrong. I'm not planning on doing something wrong, but I do want some insurance to help offset that risk. So it is something different. It's intended to cover those situations where people are claiming that directors and officers breach their duties, as opposed to just sort of insurance to cover stuff in the normal course of business. Great question. And like I said, kind of doing, talking to an insurance broker is a good way to get more information on what's right for your organization. Carmen asked a great question. What do you do if you're a new executive director and can't find all these essential documents? I got a couple suggestions. It's not going to be perfect. One, do your best, talk to everyone you can. At some point, you're going to end up with what you end up with. If there are certain things you can find online. Your articles of incorporation are on the California Secretary of State's website. You should be able to find them there. That's a good start. Your bylaws are not necessarily file. One trick I've used in the past is go on to the California Attorney General's website, because sometimes when you register, you dump all of your documents with them, and you might have a historical version of those documents. Beyond that, though, it's just time to start, constructing and moving forward. Do you know who your board is? Are you prepared to adopt new bylaws, adopt new policies? Talk to a lawyer. And kind of assess what you need and how you can fill in the blanks if you can. And yeah, it's a great question and common situation. So, but all this stuff is, like I always tell people, this is the nonprofit sector. This isn't the heart surgery sector. It's okay. We'll always find a way to kind of fill in the gaps. It's really sort of going about things with a good process is the way to move forward. And I think, which is a good segue to, these are the people at the top. I mean, these are the four agencies that we think about as a California nonprofit. And I will just warn you that whenever I make presentations, I end up making a lot of charts that are probably sillier or more convoluted than they need to be, but they make sense to me, and hopefully they make a little sense to you as we go. This is one of them. I want to start by introducing those four agencies. By being a nonprofit in California, you sign up to deal with all four of them. the Internal Revenue Service. That's the agency, obviously, that regulates your tax exempt status as a 501c3 organization. There's the Franchise Tax Board. They are the California equivalent of the IRS, and make sure you're exempt as a California organization. There's the California Secretary of State, and that is who you incorporate with, and your status as a nonprofit corporation is maintained with them. And there's a California Attorney General, and in some sense, you've heard me use their name the most. I would say the two regulators that people think about the most as a charity are the IRS and the AG. The IRS is, controls their tax exempt status. I would say the AG is about regulating charitable trusts. Any charity, it means you're subject to the AG telling you, are you being charitable or you're not being charitable? Are you diverting charitable funds for your own benefit? The AG is a bit more active, at least in California, than the IRS is, or certainly a bit better funded. And so both of those are very important. I mean, all four of these are important. IRS and AG are probably deal with the most substantive issues, but they and on radar. And then I want to show you what I'm doing with this chart, which is I took different kinds of nonprofits. Everything on here that I listed is sort of a 501c3, set aside the government grant program thing. Everything, churches, faith-based organizations, public charities, private donations, they're all different kinds of 501c3. I kind of wanted to spread them out along sort of least regulated to most regulated. Why did I do that? Well, depending on the kind of organization you are, you have more or less degrees of scrutiny. For example, for First Amendment and other reasons, churches are the least regulated type of nonprofit. And I'll just give you my personal opinion. Sometimes I think that's not a great thing for churches. I think that causes a lot of harm and we'll talk about some of the details. But one of the good things about regulation is it forces you to pay attention to your organization, because you're going to try to keep up with these four agencies. If you have very little requirements, you're going to let things slip, and eventually, it might seem great that you don't have to handle these filings at first, but it can actually be a harm to not be forced to check in with your organization. So when I'm talking to churches and faith-based organizations that sometimes get these benefits of lower regulation, I'm often finding more problems than I am in other places because nobody's looking over their shoulder. Public charities, private foundations, I won't get into too many of those distinctions right now. It's for another talk, but just kind of conceptually, remember that if you're in that sort of category on the left, you're a church, you're a faith-based organization, maybe the least regulated, and in general, operating public charities are generally have it favorable. So you're on the kind of left side of the spectrum. Let's pivot to one more slide here. Sorry, my mouse. Here we go. Let's start by talking about the IRS, everybody's favorite. The IRS, I'm going to break it into churches and non-churches. If you're a church, you don't need to do a tax exemption application to the IRS if you meet the requirements. Said you might want one. Why? Well, people can say they're a church, but then someone wants to give you money and they'll ask you, well, is this a deductible donation, or I'm a foundation and I want to make a grant? And you're going to say, well, yeah, you can. I'm a church. I'm a public charity. And they say, how do you know? Like, well, I just am. And that's not always very helpful for your grant makers and funders. It's also, frankly, churches, whether something is a church or not, is sometimes a gray area, and it's good to get confirmation. So I often encourage church clients to file a 1023. That 1023, if you hear me say 1023, that's a tax exemption application. The IRS, there's no annual information return for the IRS. So every other charity's got to do a Form 990, but not churches. But that doesn't mean that you never have to pay taxes. There's situations where organizations need to pay UBIT, unrelated business income tax. We'll talk about that in a little bit. You're not exempt from it just because you don't have a filing. Sometimes churches seem to think they are. So you have all the same responsibilities. You're just filing less forms to tell the IRS how you're doing. And maybe this is a good point to talk about what's a church and what's a faith-based organization. A church doesn't just mean a Christian church, obviously. It refers to any denomination. First Amendment, we don't favor any religion over another. But it does refer to the concept of an organization that has a congregation, that has certain set beliefs, that has certain tenets. And it refers to sort of the organization conducting the worship activity. It doesn't refer to, if the church sets up a hospital, it doesn't refer to the hospital. If the church sets up a clinic in your community, it doesn't refer to that. And so, churches do some of the things, and sometimes under the umbrella of the church. But it's important to understand that just because you're religious doesn't mean you're a church, and you don't necessarily get the full suite of benefit. And so that's what's a church. And if you're not a church, and even whether you're a faith-based organization or you're not, or any other kind of organization, you're treated the same way with the IRS. You need to file a tax exemption application, typically within the first 27 months. You need to file a Form 990 each year. And if you want to be a public charity, you have to pass a public support test. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And you file a 990T and pay tax if you generate UBIT, and talk more about that later. But you have, so if you're not a church, you have meaningful obligations with the IRS, both at the beginning and every year. And get your questions into the chat if you have them. There's going to be a little pause once I kind of get through these 4 agencies, and we'll sit and talk for a second. The Franchise Tax Board. This is the one everybody forgets about. This is California's version of the IRS. If you're a church, you actually do need to establish state tax exemption. So you don't have to worry about a federal exemption application, but you do have to apply in California to be exempt from California income tax. So make sure if you haven't done that already and you're a church, go ahead and do that. You don't need to file annual returns once exemption is established, but you do need to pay UBIT just like under federal law. And in terms of everyone else that's not a church, faith-based or otherwise, you need to file an initial tax exemption application. The good news is that what 99% of charities do is they'll do their federal tax exemption application. They'll get back a determination letter that says, yay, you're a 501c3, and they can do a simple filing called a 3500A and send that off to the Franchise Tax Board and get a state letter. Very common that I see charities don't realize they need to do that. So if you haven't done that, check in on it. And just like you need to file a 990 with the IRS each year, you need to file a 199 with the Franchise Tax Board each year. There's just like with the federal level, there are short forms if you're small enough, but you need to do something each year. And if you don't do it for long enough, you can get revoked. So do yourself a favor and make sure that you're not just filing 990s. If you need to file 990s, you're also filing 199. And just like everyone else, you need to pay tax if you generate UBIT. Secretary of State, this applies to everybody. Everyone needs to file their articles of incorporation to establish existence. You don't exist as an entity unless you have articles of incorporation. You need to file your initial statement of information within 90 days of formation. And you need to further file biennial, which means every other year, statements of information. And it's just going to list your officers and address. These are really simple filings, but they're a real pain in the neck if you don't do them. You should be getting a notice in the mail from the Secretary of State, but you need to do it whether or not you're receiving them. So make sure it's easy enough to do. Go to the Secretary's website. You can look up your organization. You can see all the filings you've ever made, and it'll tell you if you're delinquent. And your statements of information are going to be due every other year from the date you formed. And this applies to both public benefit corporations and religious corporations. The only difference is what kind of articles you have. And then it might change the form you file some of your things on, but otherwise the same. The last one. So I'm going to move my video because it's blocking the text. There we go. Is the California Attorney General. And this is where we're making kind of a different separation. Up till now, we've been talking about churches and non-churches. Now I'm talking about religious corporations and public benefit corporations. You heard me break those out at the beginning for a reason. If you're a religious corporation, good news. You don't need to register with the Attorney General. You don't need to do any annual filings with the Attorney General. And they have significantly less say in your business. It is possible for them to audit for certain limited things. And I still wouldn't get on their bad side, but they are they have limited involvement in religious corporations. So if you're a religious corporation, you have that benefit. But first thing, confirm you're a religious corporation. Don't just assume because you are religious that you have this. You actually need to meet that category. The other kind of nonprofit corporation is public benefit corporation. And if you're in that category, you actually have significant filings with the AG. You need to register with a Form CT1 within 30 days of receiving funding. And you need to file Form 99 RF1 every year. Now, what I would typically say is that whoever you're doing your 990 should be doing 3 forms. Your 990, your 199, and your RRF1. And each of them have a bit of financial information. So it's really an accountant, tax preparer type person that should be doing these things. Really, really important to stay up with the AG on this. The AG is not not always the friendliest regulator. And if you are out of touch with them for a long time, what I usually tell people when I'm trying to get them to listen to me is to remember that the AG is law enforcement agency. The thing about law enforcement agencies is, notwithstanding what the Constitution says, they tend to assume you're guilty until proven innocent. And so if you've spent 5 years not filing any forms and you have some transaction you can't explain, they're going to assume you're the worst person in the world until you prove otherwise. And so it's really important to stay on top of them, and to stay in their good graces. And like these are all, each of these things I've mentioned with each of these agencies independently, very easy. People ask, well, should I set up a nonprofit? It seems like it's a lot of work. And it's like, you know what? If you have one person that watches this presentation, knows what they're doing, can do these forms, has a calendar reminder to do these forms every year, it's not so bad. It only gets bad when you mess up. And then there are things to do to get back in good standing, and audits to deal with, and all that kind of stuff. And so, whatever the expression is, it's too early on my end to remember. Ounce of prevention is better than something. Yeah, prevention is important. I'm going to
Pound a cure.
Yeah, there we go. Pound a cure. Thank you. I'm going to pause for a second just to check in on the chat before we pivot. I just want to talk a little about fiscal sponsorship. And I did get one question. I'm going to follow up on you in a bit, so don't worry. You'll learn more than you ever wanted to know. The IRS recognizes house of worship as 501c3 if they have filed with the state. That's right. And I was going to put it in my own words. If you're a house of worship and you've incorporated, that should be all you need to do to be a 501c3 if you meet the definition of a church. You still have the option of filing an exemption application. You may want to, you may not want to. Some churches do, some churches don't. Either way, once you do that, you're done with the IRS. You don't have to do annual returns. But yes, that's absolutely correct. That churches get, that's the big benefit of the doubt that churches get, in addition to this sort of basically being impossible for the IRS to audit. And I think Michelle does it to me directly, so it may be good to circulate that too later. This also applies in some cases to auxiliaries of churches and things associated with churches. Just understand the definitions are kind of technical. Start with the assumption that if you're a religious organization, do you meet the definition of a church? That's great. If you're closely affiliated with a church, maybe there's ways you can get some of the benefits. Just know that it is a bit of a it's a definition to satisfy and something to look closely at before you assume you're off the hook. And so I'm going to pivot to start talking about fiscal sponsorship now. And this might seem like a hard pivot, and I guess it kind of is. One way to kind of gracefully segue here. Sometimes organizations hear about all the hassle I just walked through, and they're like, I don't know that I want to set up my own nonprofit. I might just want to coast off somebody else's. Maybe I don't know if it's going to be big enough. Maybe I don't have the capacity to take on all the administrative burden of my own organization. Maybe I don't know how long I'm going to be doing this. Maybe it's just a 6-month project, and if that's the case, it's good. Fiscal sponsorship is a great thing to consider. Fiscal sponsorship is where an existing charity sponsors your project instead of you forming your own organization or by granting to you. And so I broke that into Model A and Model C. We'll break out what those mean there in a second. But fundamentally, what it means is when money is donated to the project, it's not donated to you, it's donated to your fiscal sponsor. Your fiscal sponsor has discretion and control about what you want to do, but you and them have a very trusting, positive relationship, and they're either going to re-grant to you, or they're going to hire you, or they're going to hire contractors. And that's fundamentally how fiscal sponsorship works, a relationship of trust where an existing charity adopts you. The pros, well, you get access to charitable donations and you don't have to establish your own nonprofit. You don't have to read that chart I just did. Sponsor handles all that stuff. They handle all the filings. They're the organization in existence. They're the organization that's regulated. They have a board. What are the cons? Well, I said it's a relationship of trust. Ultimate control in a fiscal sponsorship is in relationship has in the hands of the fiscal sponsor. You're trusting that they're going to keep using it for your project and granting to it and relying on you to do it, but it really is a matter of trust. And you'll hear words like kind of pass through and conduit and tossed around for how fiscal sponsors can work. That's not how it's supposed to work. the way it's supposed to work is that they're vouching for you. Think of sponsor in that way. I'm vouching for what you're doing. I'm agree to make you part of my activities and accept money for your activities. But at the end of the day, I have to have control. And when I talk to fiscal sponsors, they're like, well, I can't imagine ever not doing what the project wants. I want them to do whatever they want. And that's where I usually say, well, what about if someone's embezzling, right? What if someone's doing something that's just not at all what the project is? What if they're wasting the money? I mean, you have fiduciary duties. So that's the downside of fiscal sponsors, that lack of control. The sponsor has that control. You're relying on trust. And it's important to understand that. The other downside that people think about is fiscal sponsors generally charge a fee for their time, whether that's to sort of offset just the administrative costs of running the project for, running the back end of the project for you, or to help, foster, create funds for other charitable projects a sponsor might do. Both of those are what can be things that fees used for. So that's a common con. I'm going to give you a couple charts to look at. The first is Model A. And sorry for the fuzzy thing. This is like a chart I created years ago and just keep screenshotting into oblivion. But this shows a Model A fiscal sponsorship. I think this is probably 80% of fiscal sponsorships, 90%. It's the one people most understand. In a Model A fiscal sponsorship, there's only one organization, fiscal sponsor, there's only one legal entity. And what that legal entity does, it sets up a little fund for your project. So Karl's project. And Karl's project, when people give money for Karl's project, they're giving money to my sponsor. They're not giving money to Karl. They're giving money to the sponsor. And the sponsor ultimately could say, yeah, we don't like Karl anymore. We're going to do this project differently. But generally speaking, they don't, because that's the business model. And they say, okay, Karl, we're raising money for your project. We're going to let you run with this. You need to let us know what you're doing. You need to follow these rules. Here's our rules about how money is spent. But we're generally going to listen to you in terms of how you want to run this project, run it however you want. If you do that correctly, it can be a really great way for me, Karl, in that situation, to have the benefits of a nonprofit without setting it up. It's just you'll see in the chart that donors are giving to the sponsor. There's the project leader, that's me, or the advisory committee that's kind of outside the organization, but weighing in and really kind of running this project. And then there's that little rectangle inside that represents sort of the restricted fund, the purpose restricted fund that people are giving for the project fund. Model C is the other kind of fiscal sponsorship. Model C, and there's theoretically a bunch more, but I find that everyone is usually using one of these two. Model C fiscal sponsorship is where the donors give to the sponsor. So same thing, there's a fiscal sponsor, existing public charity donors give to it. It's for the Karl project. But now the Karl project isn't at the sponsor. Karl's not an employee of the sponsor. He's not a volunteer to the sponsor. He's not a contractor of the sponsor. Karl has his own entity called Project Inc. in this imaginative chart. And I'm doing my project over there. And I'm not a 501c3 yet. Maybe I'm in the process of applying. Maybe I don't know if I want to apply at all. Maybe I'm even a for-profit. Not impossible for it to be a for-profit. And what I'm going to do is receive a grant. And the thing about grants is it's a restricted grant. I can't use the money however I want. I can't just distribute out profits. I need to use it only for the activity. But the benefit is I have my own organization and have greater control. So once the money shows up in my hands, I have greater control. That's a great pro of a Model C. The con, I guess, I have to set up my own entity for it, but that can be good for incubating new organizations. So this is another great way to do it. I just want to make the point of, before I break for questions, the biggest, you see in both of these charts, there's money going to the fiscal sponsor. There is, the sponsor has discretion and control. When this is done wrong, it is when people just ignore the sponsor, when the project kind of runs amok without any oversight, when the project presents their project to donors as earmarked for them. And I can also just say, my big comment is, this can really go wrong when the trust relationship breaks down. Because when the trust relationship breaks down, guess what? One of these parties has all the control and the other one doesn't. Everyone expects the money to go to the project, but the sponsor has all the control, and it can get pretty messy. Even just this year alone, I've done 2 or 3 messy fiscal sponsorship breakups. And what I always encourage people to editorialize a bit is, be careful before doing a fiscal sponsorship as a one-off, or whether you're the project or the sponsor. if you're going to get into fiscal sponsorship, there's a lot you need to learn about it, a lot of what you need to learn to do it right. And it can be a great thing for the sector to enable a lot of people to do their activity. But doing it on a one-off basis, or doing it or working with someone because, well, they share our mission, they share your mission, they might want to take control of your organization at the end, could take control of your project at the end. There can be more conflicting interests. So it's just something to think about. Fiscal sponsorship can be really great, but it should be approached thoughtfully, like anything else. I'm going to break for questions. I'll take a couple questions. I know I may have a couple in the chat. And then I know our break is coming up soon. Is Model C even legal? Seems dangerous. It's such a great question. It's legal when done correctly and illegal when done incorrectly. It is legal for a Model C to be done appropriately. You really need to have it be that the fiscal sponsor, so let's say fiscal sponsor is charity A, and then there's the project over there in B, and they've set up their own entity. Maybe they're a new charity and they're on their way, but the IRS takes forever to get that 501c3 letter. And it's legal if what the first organization does is, look, I say, I'm raising money, and I think a really good charitable idea is to get to that organization over there because they're doing great stuff. And I know that not only do I think they're doing great stuff, I'm going to require them to do great stuff. I'm going to collect reports for them about the great stuff they're doing. And if they don't do the great stuff, they're going to have to repay me all the funds, and I have a contractual ability to get it back, all that stuff. And so it can be done right, just like any grant making can be done right. So Model C kind of comes from the Friends of model, which is where U.S. charities grant to foreign organizations. When done correctly, those are great. When done incorrectly, those are tax fraud. And so I think Carmen's question is a really good reminder that, like, doing a Model C correctly can be helpful and beneficial and is good. Doing a Model C incorrectly can be quite bad. And if you ask me, do I think things are done correctly more often or incorrectly, I'll withhold it's probably incorrect. The slides will be shared. I'll answer that question real quickly, and I'll come to the second part of it in a second. Carmen also asked the question of how long should your organization have a fiscal sponsorship relationship? It's a really great question. I mean, there are some fiscal sponsorship relationships where it really is an incubator role, right? Where it's sort of like, you're going to see if this is going to turn out. When I always talk to new nonprofits, and I'm often steering people to fiscal sponsorship, by the way, I'm often saying, and which is bad for business for me because I'm a lawyer for nonprofits. I don't have any client if I tell them to fiscal sponsorship, but I'm saying, like, look, the thing you want to do, like, if you don't know if people are going to fund it yet, it could be great just to live under someone else's umbrella. Once you have enough money that you can actually pay for all those admin costs, maybe it's worth it to go and get that control and really, and also have sort of that direct narrative with your funders that we exist, we're our own thing, we don't exist under somebody else. It's different for everybody, but I see some that, it's just for the period while they're waiting for the determination letter. Some where it's just a couple of years where they're going to figure out, are people going to want to give to this or not? Or is our revenue model going to work or not? And then some that stay forever. There are fiscal sponsored projects that have go for decades under a fiscal sponsorship, and everyone's very happy. And I'm just trying to adjust my window so I can read all your great questions. Yeah, I think Michelle's asking a good question, and my guess is it relates to that sort of church question. So the question is, can you speak on the philanthropic sector more requiring 501c3 status when it's not required by the IRS? So, like I said, churches are automatically 501c3s by virtue of they don't need to apply for exemption. What you have is a proof problem. And if I am and Spencer's giving you money, if I'm an individual and you tell me I'm a church, okay, here's the money, and I think they'll give me a deductible donation, and that's fine. The larger the numbers get, the greater the risk that someone's going to say, look, I know you say you're a church, but you don't have any determination letter proving that to me. And it sort of depends on the kind of organization. Like, if I look at it, I don't know, if the Methodist Church came and told me they're a church, I would believe them. And you should hear some of the kinds of organizations that people want to set up and call churches, I'll tell you. And so if something's a little less obviously a church, I might be more risk averse. Foundations can be kind of risk averse. So that I think when the philanthropic sector probably means foundations and donor advised funds. So donor advised funds can only grant to public charities, the same with private foundations. And so they're going to want proof before they cut that check. And that proof, the easiest kind of proof is a determination letter. That's why earlier I said, churches don't need to apply for tax exempt status, but if you're going to be approaching the philanthropic sector, it's going to be a lot easier if you do. So you may be able to convince some of them to just sort of say, look, obviously we're a church, could you just write us a check, and they'll say fine. But there are going to be some that follow more strict policies if they want a determination letter or bust. And Michelle is absolutely right. There are tried and true fiscal sponsors. I'm going to underline that one more time. If you're in the position of being a project, I encourage people go with organizations that are in the business of being a fiscal sponsor, not just someone doing it for the first time. Just again, point of experience. I know we're approaching our break. I think I put the would it be useful? I'm just going to skip ahead a couple slides for a second just to make sure. Yeah, okay. We're one away from the break, so I'm going to try to get through that. I am somehow on track, even though I'm terrible at timing, but somehow I've stumbled into being exactly on time. We got about 5 minutes for the break, and I just kind of want to give you kind of a preview of the second half of the conversation. And we can cover more questions. I don't know if I got to all of them, but we can pick them up at the end. Let's talk about 501c3 compliance. So just as a reminder, 501c3 is an internal revenue code section. So this is all tax law. That's why I get to tell people I'm a tax lawyer. When I say get to, I mean have to. No one wants to be a tax lawyer. This kind of chart, and I'll come back to this at some point. I'm going to spend a little time breaking it down now, but there's a lot of information in here. And I have a couple of questions kind of coming through along the lines of Dave resources. We have lots of free resources on our website. I hand out free resources liberally. If people want to talk to me, just reach out and feel free to ask some of these questions to me if I don't answer them today. I love talking to small organizations and trying to point them in the right direction. So the fundamental requirements. Let's start on the left side. Operational rules of flexibility. The fundamental thing that 501c3s need to do is operate exclusively for charitable, educational, religious, or scientific purpose. Exclusively doesn't exactly mean exclusively, but it does mean you can't have any other significant purpose or activity. No substantial non-charitable activity. So maybe you have a coffee shop you run in your organization, and that's not a charitable activity, but that alone is not going to sink your tax exempt status. But generally, if you're taking on a new project, you want to make your vetting that it's a charitable, educational, religious, or scientific activity. Sometimes those things are pretty obvious. Sometimes they're not. And a lot of the time I spend talking to people about what's charitable and what's not. And that's actually one of the questions about, I'd like to try to find some time to talk about for-profit, nonprofit differences at some point, because that tends to be where people kind of lose the thread. There's no set distribution requirement for a public charity. You might hear that private foundations have to spend at least 5% a year. Public charities don't have that, but they do need to operate, and then those operations need to be commensurate in scope to its assets, whatever that means, which is just, the right amount. Don't sit on all your money and not doing anything. Don't go dormant for years. You could be revoked as a result. You need to invest prudently and act charitably. You don't have the private foundation rules to worry about, which make this complicated, but you still need to invest prudently and act charitably. If you have $10,000 in the bank account, don't go buy Bitcoin with it. That's not necessarily investing prudently. Certainly not as 100% of your portfolio. And act charitably. Make good decisions about what's advancing your purposes. You can do some lobbying, and that's a training unto itself that we do. But it needs to be insubstantial. So lobbying refers to influencing legislation. A lot to talk about there. And if your organization's engaged politically, I encourage you to get training, and there's good resources on that stuff on our website and elsewhere. No partisan candidate activity. This is a very hot topic for churches and faith-based organizations, in part because there's been sort of a long policy of non-enforcement by the IRS. But to be clear, it is still prohibited for pastors, anyone else, to say, we support this candidate on the pulpit. No partisan candidate activity. On the right side, I'm not going to cover the right side. That kind of covers more of the deduction rules. I think you guys know that, public charity is one of the perks. There's really two perks of being a 501c3. One is that you don't pay taxes on your income. That's nice. Two is that you get the people who give to you get deductions, and alongside that, it lets private foundations and donor advised funds give to you easily. So it's nice to be a public charity. So that brings us to the middle box on the bottom. What do you need to be a public charity? Well, you either need to pass a public support test, and my guess is that's what most of you do. You need to be a supporting org. I don't think anyone here is a supporting org, and I won't bore you with what it means. Or you need to be a special kind of organization, and one of those is a church. So if you are a church, and like going back to, these are the kinds of organizations that don't file exempt status, they're houses of worship as a good term for it. They are automatically, not only they don't have to apply, they're automatically public charities. Doesn't matter who gives to them. Everybody else has to pass what's called a public support test. That means that your donations need to be spread out among enough people that when the IRS runs a bunch of complicated calculations, you have 1/3 public support or greater. And there's other tests that could be lower, could be higher, but you'll get the idea. The idea is, you need to be fundraising from the public. If your money all comes from one company or one individual, it could cause you to flunk a public support test. So that's an important concept for public charities. It's something that when I talk to them comes up every once in a while. You'll see the problem coming on your 990s when you file those each year, but important to keep an eye on. And lastly, I'll just cover the thing at the top, which is that's my the person up there is sort of the insider. How can insiders, directors, officers, highly paid people deal with the public charity? Well, they can engage in transactions with the public charity, but they need to be fair market value. That's what FMV stands for, fair market value. That means you can have the transaction, but the charity needs to be getting a fair deal or better deal. Pretty self-explanatory. No excessive private benefit. Excessive is one of those magic words that nobody knows what it means, but it means that your public charity can't be providing benefit to individual people or companies that's more than incidental to its charitable purposes. So the best way to think about that is, like, it can't be operating in a way where it's intentionally helping particular companies or particular people benefit. And there can't be any inurement. Inurement refers to distributing out the profit. So if I set up an LLC with my friend and we split half the profits each year, well, that's great. That's how we're supposed to be doing. We set up a nonprofit and we have a revenue generating activity and we just pay ourselves however much the profits are each year. That's called inurement. That would disqualify your organization. So you don't want to pay yourself in a nonprofit based on profits. That's what the whole nonprofit thing is about. So it is actually really important and important to think about when you think about how you pay yourself. So I think that brings us up to our break for 5 minutes. Feel free to turn your audio video off. Don't leave the Zoom room, and we'll pick up in about 5 minutes, which will put us about 10:10.
Hi, real quick. This is Ebony. I'm gonna pop on camera real quick. We have a quick little raffle we want to do, and it won't interrupt your break. I hope it won't interrupt anything, Carl. Your break. So if y'all all game for it, I think it's fun questions. So raffle off 2 gift cards, $50 value each. We're going to do one quick little pop quiz right now, and then we do one towards the end. So give everyone time to kind of get it together. So my questions, you can type it in the chat, or I need y'all to help me at a curve to tell me who popped in first and answered it correctly, or you can unmute yourself. The first one is, what famous romance novelist lived in San Francisco? And I'm going to give you a hint. Several of the books were turned into Lifetime movies.
Oh.
Uh-oh, Carmen, you know this?
No.
No, you would have known this.
The first thing I thought is, I'm sure it's wrong, but I thought it was Mary Higgins Clark, but I'm sure that's wrong.
That's wrong.
Oh. Carl, you know the answer. Don't act like you don't know this answer.
I see Ida. Ida.
Danielle Steele.
Yes.
Oh.
Thank you, Ida.
Ida, can I borrow $50?
You are the winner. We will get that to you. I'm going to mark it down and we're going to figure out how to get it to either email. I think it's a digital. Do we have a digital gift card? Simone, is it digital or will we send it in the mail? Is Simone on?
Oh, we could do either.
Okay,
do digital.
Perfect.
Do digital.
Perfect.
She can get it today.
Okay, perfect. So Ida, I will make sure we get that to you today by the latest Friday. And
All
thank
right.
you. And then we'll do another one towards the end. Thank you all and
Okay.
have a fun 5-minute break.
Thank you,
I
thank
did
you.
know that answer too, and I didn't feel like it
You
was right to
did?
get involved.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, Carl, we could have gone to lunch at Skoma's. I don't want to interrupt your break, but I think it would be better to make this announcement now than at the end because people pop off at the end. But I just want to put in a plug for our next session because I'm going to be presenting in our next session and I'm very excited about it. But one of the things we're going to do is introduce a brand new topic, and it is called hybrid program planning. I personally taught program planning at Occur a long time ago. And now that we have had COVID, people going on Zoom, people leaving organizations, constituents moving around, we don't even know if all of the people, if when we're talking, anybody's listening, or if when we're talking, we even know the people who are listening. There are so many Zooms and so many Facebook presentations that it's really hard to do program planning. What we like to do in this session is what's called hybrid program planning. We're going to use the technique of regular traditional program planning, and we're going to insert technology so that not only will your programs be better, you can expand your reach, you will be able to get more funding, your program will be more on target, and all it really requires is that you use technology in a very strategic way, combine that with the program planning you've been doing. So we're really excited about hybrid program planning. And I personally and my co-presenter hope that you will join us in June for that session, hybrid program planning. Thanks a lot. And now I'll let you take your break.
So I guess the break will be over at 10:14.
Looks like we're hitting about 10:15, so I don't know if now is a good time to get started again. Give everybody a second. And I will just quick roll through the chat, maybe while people are coming back, just to kind of hit a couple questions I didn't quite get to cover. One person asked, LaDonna, what steps are needed to update your bylaws? It depends on what your bylaws say. There's sort of two possibilities. What I hope the answer is that your bylaws say that the board alone can amend the bylaws, and in which case the board can just amend the bylaws by a board vote, typically, majority at a meeting in which quorum is present, majority of your directors. So easy enough to do. If you are, if your bylaws say something else, like you have members and they need to vote on who can update the bylaws, or maybe a particular person has the power to consent, you need to clear those requirements. And I'll just kind of reiterate my offer, happy to chat, even if you don't end up kind of engaging, just to make sense of what your bylaws say. It's a thing I'm happy to do. Carmen asked if I do
Thank you.
trainings. Yeah, no problem. If you do trainings or capacity building on how to be a legit fiscal sponsor, that's like we certainly all the time with clients, work with a number of clients and fiscal sponsors, and I think it's a talk that me and one of my other attorneys, Charlie Golland, are starting to work on putting together and to do those kind of trainings, because I just love fiscal sponsorship when it works great, and it stresses me out when it goes poorly. So that's definitely something we'd be happy to offer here, anywhere else, anytime, just let us know. And with that, I think I've caught up on questions, but please, feel free to use this time however best for you. So feel free to drop your questions in. I'm going to keep going. Let's talk about money, always fun. This is another chart I made. And again, I think this chart makes sense to half people, and now people, it's, everyone, it makes sense to me. And maybe that's it's the only person it's useful to. But I started making this chart back when me and Asha Wilkerson, one of the other attorneys, who used to give this talk with me for the last couple of years, and it was wonderful. And some of the slides you'll see here are borrowed from on the employment staff. We worked on a talk together on sort of figuring out whether you want to be in a for-profit or a nonprofit. And I borrowed this slide from that I created there from that. And what I tell people so often is whether a for-profit or a nonprofit is better is, it's not about how great your activity is, because for-profits can do really good charitable stuff. Nonprofits can do stuff that isn't all that inspiring. It's not, there are, they need to be charitable, of course, but that's important. And the sort of halo effect of a nonprofit is important. Maybe it's just of course this needs to be a nonprofit, and that's great. But at least start by sort of asking this question, is what kind of money, where's the money coming from? Because the reason to start a nonprofit, the ultimate reason to start a nonprofit, because it will unlock resources that you wouldn't otherwise have to do the stuff you want to do, whether that's deductible donations, whether that's contracts with certain kind of government or other nonprofit entities. That's the reason to set up a nonprofit, practically, if you're sort of in the entrepreneur stage. And I kind of put it from left to right. On the left is income funding that works better in a for-profit, and on the right is income funding that works better in a nonprofit. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these, but I'll kind of point out a couple obvious ones. Obviously, all the way over on the left, if the way you're going to get money is people making equity investments in you, buying stock in your company, well, you can't really do that in a nonprofit. So obviously you're going to do that, you need a for-profit for that. Nonprofits can sell inventory and stuff, but that's pretty rare. It's not as common for that to be a charitable activity. So that may or may not work. And the flip side, go all the way to the right, and you'll see grants from foundations or other charities, charitable donations from individuals. Those are really great. Those are things that you can really only get in a nonprofit most of the time. Other things like program fees, tuition, things like that, those are things that nonprofits don't have to pay tax on, but for-profits do. Government grants, governments might not give money to a for-profit, but they might give it to you if it's in a nonprofit. So when I'm kind of in the decision-making thing, I'm thinking about what kind of income I have. You can also just use this chart to start thinking about kinds of revenue, right? There's lots of kinds of revenue. A nonprofit might borrow from, like any other business. It might receive a program-related investment, which is a term when a nonprofit either a nonprofit or a for-profit makes an investment that's primarily motivated by achieving charitable purposes. So usually it's a low return investment, 0 interest loan, 1% loan from a big foundation, that kind of thing. Membership dues, we have this group of people that are our supporters, and they all pay dues to remain our supporters and be associated with us. Corporate donations and sponsorships. I think I've kind of covered. I did what I said I wasn't going to do and just talk about all the bullets, but this is just kind of a reminder that nonprofits can have lots of different kinds of income. Some are really optimal in a nonprofit, some work in a nonprofit, but would work just as well in a for-profit. And then there's a couple where, for-profit might be the better way to go if that's how you're going to fund yourself. So that's an important, and so as you're thinking about those kind of things, you're thinking about what your revenue plan for the future is, and being a nonprofit doesn't magically solve your money problem, obviously, as everybody knows. But it is important that when you're a nonprofit, you're just as serious about your business plan as any other organization. You're going to need to pay your bills, you're going to need to pay staff, and that you sort of going through all those lines of revenue and making sure you have a plan. And to tie this back to the beginning of the conversation, in terms of what your compliance duties, people ask me, I don't really like the question, but people ask me a lot, like, what's the sort of bare minimum our board needs to do? And I'm like, okay, well, maybe aim a little higher, but what the thing I say is, look, at that annual meeting I'm telling you to have, make sure you're reviewing the budget for the last year and you're reviewing the budget for the next year. When you review the budget for last year, did you do the things you said you were going to do? Did you spend the money you said you're going to spend? Did you raise the money you said you're going to spend? And then what are you going to do for next year? And take into the lessons that you learned from the last year. And what are your projected sources of revenue? And what are you going to spend it on? And try to hold yourself accountable to your business plan. I say this as a new entrepreneur myself. It's not always easy, but it's really important to try. I want to talk briefly about the concept of an endowment. For small organizations, don't typically have endowments. But as your organization gets larger, you might want to think about endowments in a couple different ways. I'm going to talk about endowments as lowercase e endowments and uppercase e endowments. The lowercase e endowment, sometimes just the way we kind of use it when we're talking about it, is the sort of money that's set aside for the future, right? The money that's going to help us grow. We're not going to spend it down this year. What we're going to do is we're going to take it, we're going to invest it, we're going to, hopefully generate 4 or 5, 6% on it, and we're going to spend that 4, 5, 6%, but we're not going to spend down the corpus because we want that to be here to fund it. Think about, if you had the luxury of being one of these large organizations, they might have an endowment for a particular professorship. So we're always going to have a professor of divinity studies here, and that's because somebody gave us $1 million. It's probably more than $1 million now. Let's say we're always going to pay the professor $100,000. Somebody gave us $2 million. That generates $100,000 of income each year, and that pays for the professor. That's kind of one way of thinking about endowment. For a small organization, I tend to think it's more about taking time to build up, not just spend everything of the year, but building up a savings to fund things into the future. When I talk about a capital E endowment, these are sort of things that have a real legal meaning. And if a donor says, I am giving to this to form your endowment or as an endowed gift, that has a very precise meaning, which is that the organization has to use it in the way I just described. In other words, the organization can only spend an amount of that fund that is prudent taking into account the ultimate goal, this is going to be here forever. And so what that typically means is that if let's say I'm feeling very generous and give $1 million I don't have to your organization to set up an endowment, your organization's board is going to say, okay, we have a spending policy, and this year we're going to decide how much of the endowment we're going to spend. And it's probably going to be 3, 4, 5%. There's a rule that says anything above 7 is presumptively imprudent, and you got to consider a bunch of factors. How much are we earning? All that kind of stuff. The goal is to spend kind of the income, but not the principal, and to let it grow over time. And that's a legal restriction. So if you ever end up with a true endowment, one, you have to understand how to spend it that way, and use it in that way. So and it's going to show up differently on your books. The main so that's an important way to think about it. Another important way to think about it is don't tie your hands unnecessarily when you're talking about the goal of building up an endowment. I don't know that you actually want to have those legal restrictions in place unless the donor is saying that's the only way I'm going to give it to you. And when you be strategic when you're a nonprofit with your fundraising, don't sign up for purpose restrictions that you don't want to have to follow. The best kind of money is unrestricted money. So just keep all those kind of factors into account when you're thinking about fundraising. Same goes for sort of purpose restricted fundraising. When I talked early on about purpose restrictions and gifts, that donors can tie your hands to use money a certain way. That can happen because the donor says, here is my gift agreement, and it says you have to use it on this animal shelter. It could happen because your articles say we only do animal shelters here. And it could also come because you're going around telling people and soliciting money on the basis you're going to do an animal shelter. You can't go and pivot and do something else. I don't know why I keep talking about animal shelters, but sometimes these examples get stuck. The gist is when you solicit funds, if people give in response, that creates a binding purpose restriction. If you're going to go raise money for a new building, you can only use it on that building. So just be careful. It's difficult to change purpose restrictions, and certainly without going to court to do so. So just be careful. A long way of saying, building up resources is great. We talked about a lot of different kinds of revenue for doing it. We talked about sort of the concept of an endowment, both in the concept of like the goal of sort of saving to fund the organization in the long term, and just the way that that can actually be a real binding restriction if someone gives to that purpose, and to the pros and cons of that. Maybe it'll make a donor happy, but it will sort of tie your hands as an organization. I just slide kind of run through some of those points. Be thoughtful about what the restrictions on donated money are. Be thoughtful about, how much do you need for operations versus how much you can set aside. How much do you really need? Like if you're trying to fund something with just the income, how much does that take? I mean, I gave you that example of, well, we always want to have enough of an endowment to make sure we can always pay at least this one person this amount of money. Well, it takes a lot of money to, if you assume sort of a 5% income rate, which is kind of a conservative, maybe not even conservative assumption anymore. That takes a lot of money. And community image, there's always a sort of debate in the nonprofit community about endowments and how much they should be spending, and should we be more focused on the putting out the fires now or putting out the fires later. I don't have a strong take, but I do tend to think of endowments are kind of a luxury problem. If you have so much money that you have more than, if you have enough problems you're trying to identify right now, if you have more money you can save, that's great. Most organizations are struggling just to kind of keep up with their budget and keep up with the demands now. And if you're in a position where you can start saying, okay, we're dealing with these demands now, can we think about what the future is? That's wonderful. That means you're evolving as an organization, but it's not a given. People ask me about UBIT, so I thought it would be a good time to talk about kinds of revenue generating activities. You can break the world into two categories. I'm just going to flip ahead for a slide for a second. No, I wish I could put that chart down. There's the world breaks into two kinds of business activities: related business activities and unrelated business activities. So related business activities are business activities that directly carry out your charitable purpose. So if I'm selling, let's say I'm teaching classes and I'm charging for the classes. That's a business activity, but the classes I'm teaching are so tied up with my charitable purpose that it's related. What happens when they're unrelated? Well, UBIT, the unrelated business income tax, that is a tax on unrelated business activities a nonprofit does. The idea is, if you're a nonprofit and you're conducting business activities and they're part of your charitable purpose, it's fine. You're not going to pay tax on that. That's the whole point. If you, however, are just going to go and run a restaurant like any other nonprofit, well, you need to pay taxes like any other for-profit, I should say. And so that's what the UBIT regime is intended to capture. And I just kind of wanted to spend a little time on it briefly. Related business activities that significantly have a significant causal impact on achieving charitable purposes. This is a technical term. Unrelated is anything that's regularly carried on, not substantially related. So I gave the example. Here another example would be take the Delancey Street is kind of a good example, right? If I just had a moving company, Karl sets up a moving company, that's not a charitable activity. I could turn that into a related activity if I set up a moving activity and only hired people from within a charitable class. It was a job training program. It was part of sort of a rehabilitation program. Like there are ways that you can turn businesses into related activities. So one thing to think about with your organization is if you're making money not just through the donations, but you're making money through selling stuff, making sure it's sufficiently related and feeling comfortable that way. You don't have to pay taxes on it. Because like I mentioned, whether you're a church or anyone else, if you have unrelated business income, you need to pay it. Couple other thoughts on this. Another good way to think about UBIT is the gift shop example. When you go into like a little museum gift shop, are those related? Is that gift shop related or unrelated? And the answer is it's both. When you go to buy a poster and that poster has art that's in the museum, the charity's not paying tax on that because that's related. It's part of their educational purpose is making people aware of this artwork, and it's, that's typically not going to be taxable. A lot of organizations take the position that if we're slapping our logo on it and maybe a picture of our facility and and we sell that, now that's also related because we're raising awareness of the organization. Okay, probably pushes the envelope a bit. Pretty common that people aren't paying tax on those sales. In the gift shop, when you're selling bottles of water and candy bars, those nonprofits are paying tax on that like anybody else. It's unrelated business income. That's part of it. So just these little things to think about. The unrelated business income tax, if you have to pay it, it doesn't mean it's disqualifying. You haven't done anything wrong necessarily, but you do have to pay tax on it. The tax rate is currently 21%, just like any other corporation. So you'll pay a 21% tax. There's both a federal, that's the federal tax rate. There's also a California tax rate. Good news. So maybe closer to 30% for you. You do need to monitor. You have unrelated business and income activity. You need to make sure that it remains insubstantial rather than substantial. How much is insubstantial? Look, I don't know, but what I usually tell people is that if you're unrelated, the stuff you're doing that's not related to your charitable purpose is more than 15, 20% of your income, expenses, activities, it's probably time to spin that out, either into a for-profit subsidiary or stop doing it or do it differently. It could threaten your tax exempt status. But there's room to do it to some degree if it generates positive income. Exclusions and modifications. I mean, I could bore all of you for so long talking about UBIT, but I'll just say the big UBIT exclusion is passive income. And what that means is if you're a nonprofit and you make money through rent, royalties, interest, dividends, gains, that's not going to be taxable to you under ordinary circumstances. There's exceptions and exceptions, blah, blah, blah. But, when you invest in the stock market, if you have real property you rent out to someone, those are ways of making income that you don't have to pay tax on as a nonprofit, which is great. It's tax advantage for you. So those can be ways to fund your activity. So, but what it is a long way of saying, if you're doing stuff to make money that's not directly related to your charitable purposes, or you're not sure if it's directly related, because sometimes it's a gray area for sure, worth checking in on, should we be paying UBIT? Is there any way we can avoid paying UBIT? Is there anything we need to do differently? That kind of stuff. There we go. A couple other activities in the context of fundraising. We've talked about this one a bit. I'm going to say it one more time. The charitable trust doctrine when fundraising. Just make sure you're thinking about what those purpose restrictions are. If you sign up for it, it is an enforceable restriction. The Attorney General has the right to empower to enforce those purpose restrictions against you. So just be thoughtful when you fundraise about what you're fundraising for. And if you can fundraise in a way that if you can articulate your mission in a pretty broad way, they'll maintain flexibility. That's great. Charitable solicitation registration laws. 1 second. Apologies. The charitable solicitation refers to the requirement that you need to register in multiple states. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I was trying to disguise that I'm doing this from a hotel room and a housekeeping walked in. Charitable solicitation registration refers to the idea that when you're already registered in California. If you go back to the beginning of this talk, I told you you need to register with the Attorney General, so you're good in California if you're following the rules. Once you start soliciting funds in other states, you may need to register in those states. So I mean, sometimes it's pretty obvious. Okay, we did a fundraiser in Nevada. I should go register in Nevada. I sent out 10,000 mailers to Oregon. I need to register in Oregon. Where it gets a little blurry is with the when you register in, when you conduct fundraising through the internet, because the internet is both everywhere and nowhere. When I put a little donate now button on my website, am I fundraising in Florida? I don't know. Am I fundraising in India? Maybe, I don't know. Luckily, or somewhat luckily, the AGs of different states have gotten together and kind of agreed on some core principles called the Charleston Principles. And these principles say that, look, just because you're on the internet doesn't mean you're necessarily soliciting in our state. But if you start getting a lot of money from our state, like a lot of donations from our state, or some really big donations from our state, we want you to register. And so once you're doing online fundraising, keep in mind that, you know, if you start getting really successful, that's great. But you might want to talk to either start registering in those states directly yourself, or save yourself some time and hassle and hire someone. Harbor Compliance, Labyrinth, there's a bunch of charitable solicitation registration organizations, and it might save you some time. Commercial co-ventures, another thing we could do a full talk on, for better or worse. Commercial co-ventures are one of those things that people don't often know about, and then when they find out that it's a rule, they are disappointed. Commercial co-venture, you're probably familiar with in practice. It refers to the practice of when a for-profit is selling something, in order to entice you to make the sale, they promise that they'll make a donation to a charity. So buy this bottle of water, we'll give 10 cents to your charity. It sounds great. It's great, can work really well. Downside, it's actually really regulated. Not so much for the nonprofit side, but on the for-profit side. Why is it so regulated? Well, I think it's actually pretty obvious when you think about it. There could be for-profits going around all the time promising to make donations to charities they never make. And as a result, the attorney generals in California and roughly 13 other states, I think, require those for-profits doing these commercial co-ventures to register with them and file certain reports, enter a certain agreement with the charity. It's a long way of saying, if you're going to do one of these things, make sure you're letting your for-profit partner know that there are these rules. Are they following them? If you're the nonprofit, I want to, you know, I don't encourage you to go into something that's not in compliance with the rules, even if it's mostly their problem, not your problem. Yeah, just sort of be attentive to that. It can kind of come up unexpectedly. Just follow that rule of, is someone selling something using our name? And if so, is it a commercial co-venture? Often there are ways to sort of structure these things so they're not commercial co-ventures. I don't think we have a resource out on this yet. We're working on one. But there's lots of other good resources out there. And my general approach is, if you can structure it without being one, that's probably great. Like, hey, this is a partner of ours. We love them. Maybe they're going to make some, great, we plan on giving some money to them, but don't get so specific as to say, if you buy, we will do X. Raffles. And I'm going to say the raffle we just conducted was fortunately not technically a raffle. So don't worry when I say what I'm about to say. A raffle refers to a game of chance that lots of charities do to raise money, right? That's great. Thing about raffles is they're almost always illegal in California and really most states. Why? Well, a raffle is buying a chance to win a prize based on chance. And that is also the legal definition of gambling. And if you go to your penal code of most states, you'll find that gambling is quite illegal, and that there's an exception for charities sometimes, but that there's often requirements for those. So some states are a little more liberal than California. California requires you to register in order to do a raffle, and I believe requires that you do it once a year. I don't think there's anything I talk about where there is less compliance with the rule than this, because charities are out there doing raffles all the time. And that is the reality. On the other hand, it is also true that the attorney general is out there regulating raffles, and there have been organizations that have gotten into trouble for doing raffles out of compliance. So what I would say is, next time you're thinking about doing a raffle, think about, one, can we register with the AG in order to do this in a compliant fashion? And if not, can we structure this raffle in a way so that it's not a raffle? So I'm doing this from memory, so I may get it wrong, but the gist of what makes a raffle illegal is that there's someone paying for a chance to win a prize, and it's a game of chance. So why was Ebony's raffle not illegal? Well, it wasn't a game of chance. It was a trivia contest. We got the answer right. So it wasn't just grab a ticket from a hat. That would be illegal. And also you didn't pay for it, so that's also fine. So good job. Another way you can have a raffle that is compliant is when you make the donation a suggested donation. If the donation is not required in order to get a ticket, it's not gambling because you didn't pay for it. You just made a donation. That definitely solves the gambling problem. It also makes it harder to fundraise if you don't actually require people to buy the ticket and you're giving away money. You might lose money. That's not fun. But could be good for auction. It could be good as sort of raffling off donated items that you haven't paid for. Maybe you can use it as, yeah, you don't need to pay for a ticket, but the suggested donation of $20 a ticket would be greatly appreciated. The other way to get rid of the gambling problem is to make the prize not really a prize. Good example of that would be like those poker nights they do at at whatever conference or event you go to. And I remember I went to one and I remember playing poker and I was like, the best I've ever played poker in my whole life. I made all the chips and this was like, okay, what do I get for this? Oh, nothing. This is just for the joy of winning. And it was worst time of my life. So that can be a way to sort of take away the gambling aspect of it, but it does also sort of take away the fun of it. So raffles, like I said, and you're gonna walk out of this and say, well, look, Carl, I've been to 100 events and they all had raffles. I'm gonna tell you, yeah, it's true. There's widespread non-compliance here, but just because everyone's jumping off a bridge, et cetera, important to not follow a strategy as an organization where you.
Does that mean you have to jump off a bridge too?
Yeah, exactly, Carmen. You get it. You get it. Ebony, you have your hand up?
Yes, you have everyone in a tizzy right now, I'm pretty sure.
Always.
Trying to reword everything. We can't say rap, we can't. Yeah, no, thank you for the clarification because I don't think anyone knew that. I know I didn't know that, and I do it actually my family, we actually do charge
No, of course,
raffle tickets, but it goes to a good cause to other family members in need. So we do actually do a raffle to our family.
Yeah, and look, everyone here, if you all are on the audience saying we do that all the time, look, you're in good company. You're not alone. What I would just say is, take a look at the AG has a guide about raffles on their website, and just give it some thought about whether there's a way you can do it without violating it. You'll make people like me a lot happier. And I'm trying to switch slides. I might have another break for questions. Let me kind of check through, just check on time. Looks like we got about 18 minutes left. I think that's perfect. We're about 10 minutes left, trying to wrap a little early for some announcements. Sounds great. Question regarding bylaws. Our state bylaws say a quorum is a majority. Our national bylaws say it's 50% plus one. I'm on the state board, so I assume I use the state bylaws definition. I mean, it's a great question, and you've triggered one of my least favorite topics to talk about, which is the state and national organizations where there are chapters. These ones get painfully complicated. So what I would say is, if your state bylaws trump the national bylaws, in other words, these are our bylaws and they apply, that would sort of be my default answer is you should use what your state bylaws say, and it's a majority. And I think in either case of those, if I'm not, my math isn't always great, but I think those are the same thing, should be a majority either way. But just in general, when you have a conflict between state and national, I would tend to assume it's your bylaws, but don't be surprised if your national bylaws say something like, our state chapters are required in order to be part of this organization, have bylaws consistent with these, or maybe just consistent with certain principles. So the answer is, unfortunately, read closely. And any other questions at this point? Voice, chat, video, otherwise? I have more 10 minutes of material to cover, but also I want to make sure we use the time how it's ever useful for you. I'm not seeing any. So
Carl,
yes.
This is Carmen. I just want to make sure that you leave maybe a couple quick statements on how you work with nonprofit organizations. I was looking on your online and about how you do that. And I just wanted to get some clarification on that. And if you have any ongoing trainings or TA that you do that people could avail themselves of?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to shamelessly self-promote at the end. So I'll save a couple minutes. I'll save a couple minutes at the end and also talk about some of the resources and trainings we're doing as a team. So let me get to give me about 5 minutes more to cover some of these where I pretend to be an employment lawyer for a minute, and then we'll pivot that, and then I'll hand it back to the Occurred team to make a few announcements. So let's see. And I'll talk about people. Two big issues to talk about here: employees versus contractors and volunteers. This is also the part of the presentation, I think, where everyone's like, oh no, we're doing it wrong, I'm stressed out. And I'll tell you, you're in good company, but this is whenever I'm going to encourage you to be better. The first issue is employees versus contractors. Every worker you have is assumed to be an employee. In California, it is almost impossible to be an independent contractor, even though it is so much more convenient for your organization to pay people as independent contractors. If people look like your employees, they probably are your employees. I'll talk about the specific tests in a minute. The joke I say, which isn't even really a joke, is the only way to be an independent to hire an independent contractor in California is to do what Uber and Lyft did and change the law to make your employees contractors. It is difficult. And here, let's talk about why. So you're automatically an employee unless you can show me that A, B, and C are true of this relationship. So if they're an employee, it's a W-2. You want them to be a contractor, 1099, wouldn't that be great? I don't have to withhold. But in order to do that, you have to show all three of these things. So that you should show the person is free from the control and direction of the hiring entity in connection with the performance of the work, both in performance and fact. Okay, most people can pull off A, or at least will try to pull off A. This is someone who works a little differently than an employee. They don't show up from a 9 to 5, 9 to 2, whatever. B and C are the hard ones. B is the person performs work that is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. So I'll have a lot of clients tell me, oh, that person's a contractor. I'm like, oh, what do they do? Well, they're our executive director. Oh, okay, well, it's not a contractor. That's an employee. That I wouldn't say being the executive director is outside the usual course of the business. That is fundamentally the entire business. So your executive directors, your CEOs, your data, people who are just doing the actual business of the organization are employees. Okay, let's say you somehow managed to clear that. So the example I tend to give is me. I'm a contractor to people. I send W-9s and they send me a 1099 at the end of the year when nonprofits pay for my services. Well, that's because they aren't law firms. They aren't providing legal services. So I'm doing something that's outside the usual course of their business. The last requirement is that the person's customarily engaged in independently established trade, occupation, or business of the same nature. What does that mean? Well, they don't just do this service for you, they do it for other clients. And so I'll ask the question. Yeah, it's just, people don't like this answer. So if I say that, okay, well, so-and-so is a contractor, and I say, okay, what do they do? Okay, well, there are, they do some accounting support for us. Okay, so do they have like an accounting business? They hold this out? No, they're just our accountant. They're here 40 hours a week or 20 hours a week or whatever, but they don't do this for anybody else. They don't have a business. Well, California says you're an employee now. Like I said, this is everybody's least favorite slide, but it's really important. Why is it really important? Misclassification issues are things that the IRS can come after directors of an organization personally for. So it is really important not to mess this up. And sometimes that means making tough decisions. And certainly there are lots of organizations out there that make what I call business decisions and say, look, we think there's a good argument that this person's a contractor, or we think there's a good enough argument that this person's a contractor. Yeah, we get the risk and we're going to live with it. What I would say is, you can do that. People do that. What I would say is I'd encourage you to try to do your best to make an case of their ABC. They meet this test. And if you can't, then start treating them like an employee. And that means doing all the things you got to do for employees. It's not fun, but it is. Remember, and this is like me putting my equity hat on for a second. Remember that all the rules around employees are intended to protect employees from employers, minimum wage rules, break rules, all these sorts of things. And I've had to struggle with this myself as our own business, and we've taken on people as employees. We're like, oh, it'd be so much more convenient to just treat them as a contractor because we're a new business and I don't want to have to deal with all this stuff. It is, however, intended to protect them and sort of dealing with the withholding, dealing with the wage and hour stuff. It's just part of the deal. And one thing a good employment attorney told me was, you can call them whenever you want, but they are still employees. And when it comes time to sue you for not paying them their wages, they're going to be able to sue you whether you call them a contractor or not. So just being in California, and most states, but being in California in particular, means accepting that you have probably more employees than you might want to have, and to try to follow the rules for them. Volunteer, I'm going to pivot to the question Carmen asked in a second. Volunteers generally mean not getting paid. So I talk to organizations that love to pay their volunteers and then tell me they're not employees under the test I just gave. It's an issue. It's volunteer means being a volunteer. You're not doing it for pay. You can pay for your volunteers' expenses. That's okay. There may even be some room to pay a simple stipend to cover just kind of a bunch of general expenses, but it needs to be what's called nominal. Nominal means low. Nominal means no one would mistake it that you're trying to pay them for their time and services. So be really careful when you're giving out the gift cards, when you're giving out the stipends. Treat your volunteers like volunteers. I understand sometimes you want to do them a favor and make sure you're paying them for their time. What California says, if you want to pay someone for someone's time, is great. Follow all the employment rules. So not always an answer people like. Gifts, same basic concept. Be careful. Gifts can be compensation. I'm going to skip over the last part. The slides are here. And honestly, I'd much rather Asha talk to you about them anyway. So please feel free to Asha Wilkerson. Wonderful. Check her out. I'll spend the last couple minutes talking about what I do and hand out with her. Carmen asked, we're a law firm. We serve nonprofits. We talk about all the issues we talked about today. We talk with some big organizations about bigger issues, foundations about some tax issues, talk to donors about some planning issues, but really we just act as outside general counsel to nonprofits. Work on an hourly basis. It can often work, but we try to work as often as possible on flat fee projects. Always happy to pick those up. And what I tell people, and I spend a lot of my time just giving away a lot of free advice, talking to small nonprofits that may not be able to afford legal counsel. So when you're having a trouble and you just kind of want someone to chat to, we can help kind of point you in the right direction. And if there's a project to be done, you need actual formal legal advice or something drafted, we can do our best to kind of quote out hopefully a flat fee that works. And if can, and if can't, can give you some suggestions or resources to go and at least hopefully feel like you're on the right track. Other point I'll make, a lot of resources on our website worth checking out, and we are going to try to do trainings in the future. I don't have any in particular in my mind scheduled right now, but it's sort of been a lot of them, and me and some of the other members of the team are going to start doing a few more. So I'll try to keep the Occur team in the loop so you can hear about them. And with me, I think that's it. I'll hand it back to the Occur team.
Great, give me just 1 second. All right.
Okay, so I already spoke to this, but basically we're going to be doing a training called Hybrid Program Planning. And one of the things that we've noticed is that there are a lot of plans that were made before COVID that have resulted in organizations losing funding, losing programs, losing congregation members. And we just want to show you how to use technology to come back better. I didn't say build back better. I said come back better. Okay, this is not political. So we are very excited about this because there are some platforms that you don't necessarily need that are extra, but there are platforms, technical platforms that are essential to help you with your fund development, to help you with your program planning techniques, your outreach. And so this is a very, very important session, and we hope that you can join us on June 23rd. And I want to show this to Karl. It's a first edition of Fiscal
That's great.
Sponsorship, 6 Ways to Do It Right. And it is signed by Tom Silk.
Very nice. I have one signed by Greg. So I encourage, anyone who's thinking about fiscal sponsorship should read that book, and there is a new edition out. So I'll plug my last firm on,
Please
on,
do.
on
That is
one.
a really important book for everybody to have. And Shai, that's it for this.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. We have a satisfaction survey that we would love for everybody to fill out. It's super, super helpful for us to be able to maintain our funding and just make sure that we're continuing to provide information that is helpful for everybody. So we're going to paste that in the chat. It's already in the chat from a little bit earlier, but we'll paste it again. And we'll also send it out in an email to everybody that attended. But yeah, while it's fresh on your minds, if everyone could fill that out, that would be really, really helpful.
And I just want to say one last thing before everyone leaves. Thank you, everybody. Karl, thank you so much for this. It's so generous of you every year to come and provide this. I was just calculating how much you probably charge per hour and how much we otherwise would owe you. And so it's very generous of you, and we recognize that. This is excellent. But the thing that I appreciate about your